So it's been 3 days since the M2 MacBook Pro came out, and we have done a ton of tests and comparisons and put out multiple videos. In this one, I want to give you guys a short video about the good, the bad, and the outright ugly about this laptop and my perspective for real world use with this laptop instead of just benchmarks. Now, the first thing for a positive that I want to talk about is the webcam. Now, a lot of people really hated on Apple for sticking with the 720p webcam, and I agree, they should have put a 1080p in, but it does look better. Now, the weird thing is that it's only better because of software. They tweaked the algorithm for the noise reduction, they added better contrast, or else that's what it looks like. Now, with that, the 14-inch and 16-inch and even the upcoming M2 MacBook Air are still gonna look more detailed, sharper, less noise, but at least they've done this software fix, which they should do to the previous ones, to make it look a little bit better. Now, the second thing that I noticed is the speakers. Now, in my comparison against the M1 MacBook Pro, I said that they sound about the same. I couldn't hear much of a difference, but then some of you guys called it out and said that no, in fact, the M1 has better dynamics, it sounds better. And the truth is, when we were listening, I told Vadim that I thought that the bass was better on the M1 and it sounded slightly louder. It just didn't make sense why that would happen, and because I was unsure, I was just leaving it up to you guys, but you guys spoke. And with that, when we monitored in Final Cut, it did show about a 2 decibels louder kind of volume on the M1 model. So I don't know why the M2 doesn't sound as good. The M1 already was the worst sounding MacBook out of the full lineup. So that is definitely unfortunate. Now the next thing is the fan. Now, this thing, when you're using it day to day, it almost seems like a MacBook Air that is fanless. You don't hear it unless you're doing heavy rendering for a very long time. And I'm not talking about running a couple runs of Cinebench, it still is silent. Apple let this thing heat up. The most we recorded is 104 on screen, but actually hit 105, and they didn't care. The fans only barely start to ramp up there. So they're treating it more like a MacBook Air instead of a Pro, whereas the M1 Pro, even though it uses less power and less wattage and has less heat, the fans actually ramp up quicker. Now, that is a positive if you don't want to hear the fans day to day. If you have a previous Intel model and you're annoyed of it, well, this is gonna be way better. It's a great experience not hearing that fan. But for those of you guys that are concerned about the high heat that the chip gets and how hot it gets, well, you could download TG Fan Pro and you can change the settings yourself to have it spin up a little bit earlier. You don't have to make it be crazy loud, but at least spin up if it's hitting 100 degrees. Now, one thing I really wish this thing had was fast charging. We've been testing these things, running down the batteries, and it takes forever to charge it up. Closer to 3 hours, whereas the rest of the lineup now is fast charging 50% in just 30 minutes. And so that, when you do have to charge, that is an inconvenience. But flipping over to the battery life, it is incredible for light uses. Better than the M1 MacBook Pro, which was already amazing. Now, Dave Lee actually did some very in-depth testing. He has this chart, so I'm not gonna make my own. I'll show you his. Thank you, Dave. And this thing for light uses is shockingly good, and it works really good because it has the larger, more powerful efficiency cores that Apple updated, so it doesn't have to use the performance cores as much. But on the flip side, if you are gonna start pushing it, that is when the battery life does get worse than it was before, because it is using roughly 33% more power in order to gain about 13% more performance on the CPU, and then the graphics also uses more power as well. And of course, we already mentioned SSDs in multiple videos. We made a video specifically about that performance, and this is just something that is very sad that this is happening. Now, I know Apple needs to make money. Maybe there's not enough chip supply, and so they're trying to do a single chip instead of 2, but it's just weird having a product that came out a year and a half later that is an expensive product with the Pro name on it, but the SSD is half the speed compared to before. Now, we already mentioned that. What I didn't mention is SLC caching. Now, when you're transferring a large file, most of these SSDs, they will actually slow down after a certain amount is written. And what I found is that with the 256 gig model on the M2, it actually slows down earlier. So about 45 gigs, and then it slows down from about 1,300 megabytes per second all the way down to about an average of 250. Now the M1, also the base model 256 gig, it will actually write at 1,900 from my external SSD. And it also does slow down, takes a little bit longer, but then when it slows down, it's still writing over 400. So I actually transferred a big file, which is our test folder with a bunch of different benchmarks. The M2 took 5 minutes and 34 seconds, while the M1 took 2 minutes and 55 seconds. And keep in mind, it actually would have been quite a bit faster if we had a faster external SSD. This one is just our favorite because it's universal and it's a great price. So that is unfortunate because not only will it slow down even more with the SLC cache, but also if you guys didn't see our SSD test video with real world tests, when you're opening up professional applications, a bunch of tabs, it is less responsive than the MacBook. And I wanted to do that test just to see, was I right? Was this actually less snappy? And in fact it is, and professional uses also slow down if you're loading up the same amount of tabs and applications on the M1 versus M2. The M2 gets slower, which is insane. And that just brings me to, my kind of thoughts on this machine. It should not be called Pro in 2022. Now, if this came out at the time the M1 did, it still would have been a great update compared to the Intel model, but we're taking one step back. The SSDs can't keep up with most of these Thunderbolt drives now. The whole system slows down if you open up multiple applications. So if you do want to have a laptop for light, simple tasks, you're going to get insane battery life. It's going to work well, but that means it's not a pro machine. So that is just the weird thing about it. Now we're gonna do some more testing. We're gonna look at video editing, some more in-depth stuff. So make sure you guys are gonna watch that if you guys want more info. But for your guys' questions, people are asking, should I jump to the 16 gig model or 512? Because we're now not recommending the base model because the SSDs are slow and the whole system slows down. Well, it depends on how much space you need. For example, if you don't use more than 256 gig like I do, jump up to 16 gig. If you want to have more space, well then that speed is going to kick back up to the level of the M1 at the base, even though you have to spend 200 bucks more, and that makes it a much more responsive system when you're using it. So I would end up getting more storage if you feel like you might need it, but if not, kick up the RAM. And then the hard thing is, if you kick both up, well, at that point, you're not far off from the 14-inch, which is our next comparison. And you can buy one of those for 200 bucks off right now on Amazon. So 100 bucks more than the M2. That is crazy. I will link that down below. Now about the M2 MacBook Air, they're asking, will the M2 MacBook Air have slow SSDs? We will see. I sure hope not, but I think if Apple is doing this to their Pro machine, I would expect the M2 MacBook Air to also get slower compared to the previous generation. And the last question we're getting is, should you just buy an M1 refurbished or used or at a discount compared to getting the M2 model? Well, if you're getting a good price on it, I think yes, especially if you want to get the base model, because you are going to have a snappy system. When you open up a bunch of tabs or programs, it's still going to stay quicker than if you would have had an M2 at that base configuration. And even though the CPU is faster on the M2, it's not a huge difference. You're still gonna be very happy with the M1. And then if you don't use the graphics, you're not constantly pushing it, that part won't matter to you at all. So if you're getting a nice discount, and of course Amazon has great deals, they're clearing these out now, I think you'll be happy with it, or the M1 MacBook Air, which was our favorite laptop, or until the M2 one comes out. So there you guys go. If you have any other questions you want us to cover in our full review after we've done more testing, go ahead and ask down below. Click above to subscribe. Check out one of those great videos right over there. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next video.